Good morning, everyone. My colleagues and I from QUT a paper called Protecting the Protectors, Legal Liabilities from the Use of Web 2 in Australian Disaster Response. And I've been nominated by my colleagues to present our paper at this conference. The reason why we decided to write a paper on the legal liabilities of Web 2 use, such as Facebook, Twitter, Flickr, mashups, and wikis, in disasters, we decided to write this paper for several reasons. First, we found that the public are increasingly turning to Web 2 technologies during disasters as a way of obtaining and sharing information about the disaster. We also found that recently government agencies are also beginning to use Web 2 technologies as a way of disseminating information to the public. Added to this is the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, which was set up in the aftermath of the Victorian bushfires in 2009. Now, the interim report by the Commission recommended improving information technology as a way of accelerating the updating of bushfire information on agency websites. We felt that this demonstrated the growing importance of information technology in disaster response. At the moment, there is growing research on how technology itself can be used to improve disaster response, and we heard from the previous paper exactly that type of research. And in addition to that, the Government 2.0 task force, which was set up to look at how online information can be improved. One of the projects funded by the Government 2.0 task force is Project 14, which was called Social Media for Emergency Management. Now, this project looked at how Web 2 tools and technologies can help improve location-enabled information sharing between emergency management agencies and the community. We found that at the moment there seems to be very little research on potential legal liabilities arising for disaster response authorities using Web 2 technology during disasters, hence our paper. Before I go on to present the legal liabilities that we identified in our paper, what I would like to do is to go through a few examples of Web 2 use in disasters, and that would lead me to our disaster response 2.0 model, which is what we say could be the future of disaster response. That model will show the information flows that can occur if a disaster response 2.0 model is used, and it would demonstrate the legal liabilities that can potentially arise from such a Web 2 use in disasters. So first off, current Web 2 use. I've listed 3 examples here: Hurricane Katrina and the Californian wildfires. So these are US examples of disasters. And the third example is the Victorian bushfires that occurred in 2009. Now, in all these disasters, and typically any disasters, there is a high level of information need. Those affected by the disaster require information about the disaster so they know where to go and what to do for help. The information should be localized information, it should be accurate, and it should be up to date for the information to be of any use to these people. And as I said earlier, more and more these days we find citizens and media organizations turning to Web 2 technologies as a way of obtaining information and also as a way of sharing information about the disasters with others. So in the first example, Hurricane Katrina, even before Katrina hit landfall, numerous blogs, discussion threads, and online sites were created by the public to share information about Katrina. A news blog was created by the local newspaper, and the news blog provided news on hurricane damage and recovery efforts. Calls for help were also relayed onto the blog, and the blog was monitored by rescuers, and the rescuers sent in help where it was needed. Now, this shows the value and the popularity of Web 2 use in disasters. Similarly, in the wildfires that raged across California in 2009, Web2 were also used by citizens. So those people affected by the Californian wildfires turned to Flickr, Twitter, blogs, YouTube to keep up to date with the latest fire developments. Similar also to Hurricane Katrina, the media in Californian wildfires also used Web2 technologies, and what the local news organization did was to create a geo mashup of the wildfires, and they published that information to everyone. They also used Twitter to send updates about the wildfires to their readers. The Los Angeles Fire Department in the California wildfires also used Web2 technologies as a way of disseminating information about the wildfires. So they actually used Twitter to post information about the fires. And aside from using Twitter, they used Flickr, and they uploaded images of the wildfire onto Flickr. The last example is the Victorian bushfires that occurred in 2009. And again, Web2 technologies were also used. Of significance is the geo mashup that was created by Google. What Google did was use information from the Victorian Country Fire Authority, overlaid it onto the Google map, created a geo mashup, and then pushed that out to the public. Now that mashup was so popular that over 1 million visitors accessed the geo mashup in the first week alone. So I think this shows, again, the popularity of Web2 tools in disasters and the usefulness of Web2 technologies in disasters. The examples also show currently how Web2 technology is being used. We see two broad models for Web2 use in disaster response. The first is where individuals and the media use Web2 technology as a way of sharing ground-level information provided by members of the public themselves, such as what happened in Hurricane Katrina. The second approach is where we see official government information channeled via Web2 technologies, such as the Los Angeles Fire Department use of Twitter, such as in the Victorian bushfires, where Google used information from the Victorian Country Fire Authority and then overlaid that onto a Google map to create a geo mashup. What we see potentially happening as the next stage in disaster response is a model that allows for a more dynamic collection and sharing of information, a model that would allow disaster response agencies to incorporate information provided by the public and to be used by that agency in disaster response. We call this model our disaster response 2.0 model. Now, this model will enable agencies to collect real-time ground-level information from those on the scene of the disaster. This has benefits because it can enhance disaster response, because it would provide the agency with greater situational awareness and understanding about the disaster. In addition, this would also mean that the agency can disseminate real-time information about the disaster, and that's very useful. And as well, the public in this type of model would be able to play a greater role in disaster response. And given that the public are usually the first responders in any disasters, it makes sense that they be involved in any type of disaster response. So that's a model there. And we can see those figures are the members of the public, and obviously they can share information amongst themselves using Web2 technologies. The government authorities in the middle, and they can share information amongst themselves. So, you know, the fire services, the police, ambulance, so on and so forth. Those ovals on this side, the government agency themselves would have, for example, a website where they can disseminate information. the round ovals that you see, which we call the unofficial portals, they could be any type of independent organization that could use the information and then create new information and push that out. So for example, perhaps Google using information from the Victorian Country Fire Authority and then creating a geo mashup. So that we call the unofficial sources of information. And the lines going across show the information flows, and we can see information flowing basically everywhere. Information flowing from the public to the government agencies, information flowing from the public to the unofficial sources of information such as Google, and they can use the information flowing from the government agency to Google again, and they can use the information, and then information flowing back from those sources of information back again to the public. And in addition to that, we would have the traditional form of information sharing between the government agencies themselves. So you can see that in this model, there is a more dynamic sort of information flow. It's not the traditional unidirectional information flow from the government authority to the public, but it's more dynamic. And we have more information flows generated from multiple sources. So there's a greater number of information providers in this model. There's also greater avenues of information flow in this model. But because of the greater level of information sharing, this could mean a reduction in the level of ownership of the information that's being disseminated. And in addition, because there's more sources of information, the harder it would be for the government agency to verify the accuracy of the information that's been received and then pushed out. So this shows that there are potentially problems arising from using Web 2 technology in disaster response. The focus of our research is on the legal liabilities arising for disaster response agencies from the use of Web 2 technologies. And the purpose of our paper is to highlight potential legal liabilities that can arise from that Web 2 disaster response 2.0 model, which I just showed you. In our paper, we identified 3 potential sources of liability. The first is a possible dissemination of inaccurate information. The second is a failure to provide adequate warnings. And the third is where there's an inadequate response to calls for help that are made via Web 2 technologies. So for the first potential source of legal liability, the Disaster Response 2.0 model shows that maintaining the accuracy of the information can be a problem. Now, this problem arises because in that sort of model, there are now multiple parties providing information. And in addition to that, because there are multiple parties providing information, it would also mean that different data sets can now be combined from these multiple parties to create new information that's then been disseminated out to the public. So basically, in that sort of model where you can use user-generated information to be collected and then disseminated, that could expose the government agencies to legal liabilities if the information turns out to be inaccurate. The recipients of this type of inaccurate information can potentially bring an action for negligent misstatement under common law. Alternatively, the recipient can bring an action under the Fair Trading Acts for misleading conduct. Now, if successful, it would mean that potentially the government agency is liable for the losses suffered by the recipient relying upon that inaccurate information. Now, some work has already been done looking at government liability for inaccurate information, and here I'm referring to the article written by Sharon, Christensen, Bill Duncan, and Amanda Stickley. But we say that more focused research needs to be conducted, looking at government liability for publishing inaccurate information, specifically in a disaster situation. For the second area of potential liability, we say that the liability can arise from a failure to provide adequate warnings. Under a disaster response 2.0 model, this can arise in a number of ways. So for example, the type of media used to actually send the warning out, that could affect the content of the message. So for example, if they use Twitter to send out warning messages, and if Twitter only covers 140 characters, then perhaps the recipient receiving that sort of message can argue, it's so truncated, I don't understand what it means, that amounts to a failure to warn. In addition, perhaps a service failure could result in a warning message failing to reach the public, and again, that could be a failure to warn. Question is, would the agency be responsible? Our paper identified two possible causes of legal action arising from a failure to warn. The first one, again, is where you have a situation where the agency has, under statute, a duty to issue a warning, and there's a failure to issue a warning. Then that failure can expose the agency to an action in tort for breach of statutory duty. So that's the first potential area. The second is where a failure to warn exposing the agency to an action in negligence. Now, this can arise if the agency has a duty of care, and the duty of care includes a duty to issue warnings. Second, that the duty was breached. And then third, the breach caused the loss. If all that can be shown, then again, the agency can be exposed to an action in negligence. Under current case law, it would seem that establishing a duty of care is possible, but establishing a breach of duty of care may be quite difficult. In addition, the current civil liability legislation at the moment provides some protection for government agencies. Again, this is all untested. However, there have been several class actions taken by the victims of bushfires that have occurred in Australia, such as the Canberra bushfires in 2003 and the Christmas Day bushfires that occurred in New South Wales in 2001. So these class actions show that this type of litigation can actually arise. And it makes sense that disaster response agencies understand what the legal risks are, because it's through an understanding of the risk that you can develop risk mitigation strategies that you can incorporate into everyday practices and so mitigate or minimize these sorts of liabilities from actually occurring. Moving on to our third source of potential liability, we say that this can happen if calls for help are made via Web2 technologies. And the question arises is, how should the disaster response authority respond to that sort of call for help? And what you see here on the screen is, it was a blog by the US Coast Guard, and it was speculating that what if the US Coast Guard received that sort of message on their official Twitter account with, all the misspellings and truncation. What should they do? How would they know whether it's genuine? And if say, for example, they decide not to go out to search for these people, and it turns out that they were actually trapped and sinking, would the Coast Guard be liable? And it seems that more and more these days that people are turning to Web2 technologies to make calls for help. Like in the case of the two teenage girls that were lost in the storm drains in Adelaide. Instead of ringing 000, they updated their status on Facebook. And it so happened that their friend was online, saw the message, and she made the call for help. So the question is, how would a disaster response authority receiving that message, how should they respond? And if they don't respond, will that non-action give rise to an action in negligence? So in conclusion, we find that a disaster response 2.0 model, a model that would incorporate Web 2.0 technologies, raises many questions pertaining to legal liabilities that needs to be addressed. And our paper highlighted 3 potential sources of liability. But given the usefulness of Web 2 technologies and given the popularity of Web 2 technologies in disasters, it makes sense that more research needs to be done looking in this area of legal liabilities. And not only legal liabilities, but risk mitigation strategies as well, because it's through an understanding and an awareness of the legal liabilities as well as the risk mitigation strategies that it would enable disaster response agencies to develop these risk mitigation strategies, incorporate that into the everyday practice to minimize those sorts of risks from occurring in the future. And we say that this will allow for a smoother transition to the future of disaster response, where Web 2 technologies are used to enable a more dynamic way of information collection and dissemination. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
That was kind of 2 questions, really. The first one is what about kind of data swap problems, where you're getting so much conflicting data, and who's going to process the data, and
well,
what data is relevant, and what data is wrong?
That's the problem, is that you have all these people coming up with information. How would you collate and then verify the accuracy and then put it together to push it out? And then given that in disasters, things can happen so quickly, like in the Victorian bushfires, where one day the wind was blowing this way and then the next minute it was blowing in another minute, it would be quite difficult to collate that sort of information and to send that information out in a timely manner. I mean, that would be difficult.
Yeah, and it also might be, for instance, that certain quite important information is overwhelmed by kind of almost irrelevant information. So the vital message you don't actually see.
I think there's a lot of research at the moment looking at how technology can be used to filter out those less important messages and then to take in the more important messages. So, as I said earlier in my presentation, at the moment there's a lot of research into the technology side itself and how can technology be used to improve that sort of information collection and dissemination. But there seems to be very little research to look at the legal concerns arising from the use of the technology. And we say that it should be, a side by side. You should look at the technology and then you should look at the legal liabilities as well. If there are no other questions, I shall excuse myself and make room for the third speaker.